When I make a theatre performance, I'm trying to sort of create a space that welcomes a really wide range of people, and trying to notice who's not there, trying to notice who's missing. I think it's more as I've gotten older that I really understand that there is an activism within the work. I think I recognise that there is an activism there and a choice to focus on the specificity and the skills of disabled bodies, and to actually choose to focus on the techniques inherent within disabled bodies and how we experience the world, and really also how to frame that choreographically. There's activism in choosing to make visible and to identify as disabled, and to sort of claim that as a cultural identity as well as a choreographic identity. Actually, it has inherent value, and actually for me is also a really creative source and a creative lens on the world that I have. I think I'm at that point in my career where I'm really beginning to see younger artists and new disabled artists particularly beginning to emerge, and that's really exciting. I guess I sort of subscribe to this idea that as theatre makers we're building our utopias each time that we try to make work. I would just hope that we start to see a far wider range of work that really welcomes more people, whether it's into theatre spaces or maybe the important thing is also to get out of the theatre spaces, because in my experience the problem is that the theatre spaces have been designed for a very particular set of people and bodies and have made a lot of people not welcome. So I think it's also time to start thinking about where we want to meet people, and maybe getting out of the old houses a little bit more often and meeting people where they are.
Hi, good morning. Hello, everyone. I'm Joseph Lee. Before we introduce our honorable guest today, I would like to give you a little bit of context of this series. I'm Joseph. I'm a dancer, choreographer, and a local company, Unlock Dancing Plaza's artistic director. So in this series, I was invited by the Arts with the Disabled Association Hong Kong to give moderation to introduce an overseas guest today. And this series is part of an online data bank called The Platform, supported by the Arts Capacity Development Funding Scheme, funded by the Culture, Sports and Tourism Bureau. So this is a series of The Platform is going to showcase and gather artistic practitioners with disability around the world and from different contexts, and then to share with local community that the range and tips that different artists are doing kind of like within their own context and what they can share to the local communities. So today we have our honorable guest, Claire Cunningham today, who is a Scottish choreographer, dancers, performers with multidisciplinary practices in performance making across the year, and also award winning in different contexts as well. And she has like rich experience in her career. So Claire, nice to meet you. Would you like to have a short introduction of yourself and to share a bit about you?
Yeah, good morning, although it's good evening with you. Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Joseph. That's great. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this platform. I appreciate it very much. Yeah, as you mentioned, I am a multidisciplinary performer and performance maker. That partly comes also from the fact that I trained in music as a singer. I grew up in Scotland and still live here. And we had quite an unusual situation, I guess, in Scotland, where our National Arts Funder really took a choice to invest in disabled arts practice, and I am one of the results of that. It's very much due to a lot of different circumstances, but particularly that is an important aspect in my career. So I started out wanting to be a professional singer, as a singer as a child, then wanting to be a professional singer, wanting to specialize in sort of Western classical music, and went to university to study music. And then when I came out of university, I went into a company who were training disabled people to be musicians, but more like rock musicians, and making musical theatre. And so that was how I actually ended up more in theatre, was through that company. And I began to realize that I wanted to have other skills, so that I wasn't going to make a career just as a singer. It wasn't possible to get enough work. And so began to add other things, acting, etc. And somehow ended up adding aerial skills, so like trapeze and rope, that sort of circus skills. And that was what led me unexpectedly into dance. And I moved very surprisingly into dance. And we can maybe go into that in more detail later on, but went into dance again as a performer, and then began making my own work, which again, I didn't ever expect to do, but was also partly a mercenary choice, in that I felt like it was the only way I was going to get any work, was to make work for myself, because it didn't feel like people were going to hire me into their dance companies. Maybe we can come back to that as well. And so, yeah, very unexpectedly a dancer, more unexpectedly a choreographer. And since 2007, I've been making my own performance works, usually work that I am also in. I don't tend to perform in other people's work, so I've very much sort of created my own world. And that is also built around a lot of collaborators that I've developed long term, which I'm not officially a company, but I almost feel like a company, because I have a lot of colleagues that I've worked with for a very long time, including my producers, etc. Yeah, and then this more recent shift and change, not a change, but an addition to my work, is that I've also recently been appointed as a professor in choreography, dance, and disability arts at the at HATZT, which is the dance and choreography college within the University of the Arts in Berlin. So this is a very new sort of addition to my work at the moment that I'm learning. So yeah, as well as continuing to make work, there's also this sort of new education side to my career at the moment. So that's a little potted history, but we can open it up more from there.
Yes, for sure. Because last time we also mentioned about like training in different discipline, and then now you're turning into like an educator as well. I think we can come back to this part later. But I think I'm very curious about as a trained like musician singer, which is for me actually also very bodily, but then using very different kind of performative strategies. And how did you find that bridge between like, or from like a singing background into, because you mentioned about you work with some theater director, and then that gives me like tools or like understanding of a different kind of like area of performance. So how would you kind of like share a bit more on this transition?
Yeah, I think I don't think I really understood the embodiment or how physical singing was when I was a singer. I think I understand it more afterwards as a dancer. I I think what was interesting as a singer, or the beginning, the first 26, 27 years of my life, one of the things about being a singer for me was that it was placing the importance on the song and not the singer for me. I was very, what I now understand, I was experiencing what we would now call internalized ableism. So ableism being the name that we give to the sort of the recognition that discrimination and oppression, particularly of disabled people, comes from systems and structures that have been designed in the world and in society, and is basic ableism being basically a system that that is always at play, that says one body is more valuable or more productive than another, and it manifests in everyone's life, actually. It's also very connected into colonialism and racism, etc. This idea of one body being supposedly better than another, and the systems that we use to judge that. But with disability, it's possibly most magnified and most visible. So I had grown up with a lot of the ableism in society that dictates what's beautiful and what's ugly, and expectations of what career you could have or should have, what looks graceful, what's fast, what's slow, who is fast, who is slow. So I had grown up as someone with a visible disability. My crutches are, I used my crutches since I was 14, although I was disabled from childhood. I had that experience always of being programmed by society to think that my body was deficient, that it was not as good, that it was not as beautiful. So singing for me was also about, I didn't want people really to look at me, and I didn't like people to see how I moved, because I moved differently from a non-disabled person. So singing for me was like, get on stage as, you know, quietly and as little movement as possible, and then sing. And that was the art of not being visible, mainly. And so to shift then into dance, I still sometimes am shocked at myself that I did it. It was such an extraordinary shift to make, to go into an art form then that is entirely about being witnessed and being seen for how the body moves. And it was quite psychologically and emotionally quite a thing to deal with as well, like what it means to then be making your body very visible. So I think moving into dance, I was very fortunate because I came into dance with colleagues who were very, very supportive and very open and very curious and sort of invested me with a sense of curiosity, and changed my perception about having grown up with a perception from society that was fixated on what my body couldn't do. I began to work with dancers and choreographers who were really interested in what my body did do and how it functioned, the way it functioned, rather than trying to change how it functioned. And I think that was a really extraordinary sort of shift for me, was to start. So one of the things that happened was, so I went into the aerial training. As I mentioned, I started training to work on ropes and trapeze, which was because I realized that the crutches gave me lots of physical strength in my upper body, particularly And I got really mercenary and was like, okay, how can I use this? How can I earn a living with this strength? It's part of using crutches, let's use it. And so that took me into working in this aerial equipment, and that led me into dance. And working with a choreographer, an American non-disabled white man called Jess Curtis. And when I worked with Jess, he was noticing that I was playing with my crutches, usually in the tea break, usually not when we were trying to make material, but in the breaks, I sit on my crutch, I use them like a seat, and I would do little things where I would balance my feet up on things, so take my feet off the floor and sort of almost like levitate or suspend my feet and do little, I like to play with the balancing. I found it really fun and sort of a thing that I would just do for myself. And of course, as a choreographer, he was like, that's interesting. Can you do more of that? And so the thing that was interesting, I guess, with meeting Jess was he was curious about what I was doing and how I was playing with the crutches. But more than that, he made me curious. He made me want to explore more. And I think this is always a thing that can be a little bit tricky, is that quite often you're in a situation where a non-disabled choreographer is working with disabled dancers or people who are coming into dance, and they're interested in how they move because they're moving differently, or they're bringing different qualities that have not been seen. And there can be a danger, I think, in sort of appropriating that a little bit for the choreographer's fascination. But I think what was important was really that Jess sort of made me curious. There was no sort of like, I'm interested. He wasn't saying, I'm interested in that, you have to do it. He was saying, I'm interested in that. Are you? Will we go? Do you want to go here? And so there was a real sense of empowerment and agency in that. And no, I was never being asked to do something that I didn't want to do. So I think that was an important thing, that there was consent and care over how I was working. And as I worked more in dance, I guess I didn't realize that that is not everyone's journey into dance. Like quite often dancers are really told, I want you to do this. So I think that was a really important thing that made me engage with dance on my own terms, really, because I got fascinated and I got obsessed, and really genuinely obsessed with how could I move with the crutches, what was possible. And really playing and exploring. And off of that, I then went back. I'd been working in England, and I went back to Scotland, and I applied for funding in Scotland purely to explore more, not to make a piece, just to say what would happen if I learned more about working on crutches. And part of that application was also to work with a dancer that I had seen called Bill Shannon, pardon me, who is another American white guy. But Bill is a disabled performer and artist who also dances on crutches. And he had made a really extraordinary career already. I had seen him perform while I was a singer. I saw him perform as a dancer, and I thought, that's amazing. That's great. You're a dancer, I'm a singer. But I think the distinction was, because I had seen someone dance on crutches, I therefore knew it was possible. And that's an important aspect, I think, in the trajectory for any sort of disabled individuals, is that if you don't see somebody that you can relate to, somebody that you have some sort of kinship with, it's very hard to imagine that this thing is possible. And so even though when I saw Bill the first time, I wasn't interested in dancing, it made me know that this was a thing that existed. People dance on crutches. And so I applied, I asked Bill if he would do some training with me. And when I got my funding, I spent 6 weeks with Bill, and he shared a lot of his own dance technique of dancing with the crutches. And I guess what I did was I really took the things that I'd learned with Jess, which was a lot also about, like, he works from a dance form called contact improvisation, which is a lot to do with sensory perception and really moving in an improvised way. So it's not set movement, but really is about what are you feeling, and through your skin in particular, but all of your senses, and moving based on that, and then combining it with Bill's technique, working with the crutches. And I was able to really, the funding allowed me to spend time on my own to just take all that information and play with it and explore with no sort of pressure. And what actually then emerged from that time was my first piece. Even though there was no expectation of me to make a work, being given that time and space, lots of ideas began to sort of float up to the surface, which were, oh, I wonder what happens if I do this, or can I do that? And working in that piece, I began to work with more than one set of crutches. I worked with 2 sets of crutches, and really playing with the possibilities. And so that exploration all led to me making my first solo, which is a piece called Evolution, which was in 2007. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. I feel like it's very important to unfold some of the context, like, and your experience. And I think you have touched a point, like several things that we can go on to later. For example, about the funding and infrastructure, and how does that kind of like affecting the ecology of development of disabled arts. But I think we can put that a bit later. And then how your beginning of this journey as from singer to a physical performer, which is like more on the visual. I feel like you also highlight that visibility is also political, of how like being visible and physical is also being like having that political power of being seen, and that can also trigger imagination of how one body and person to be seen and perceived in different ways. And also about the ethical implication of how to collaborate and how to allow that agency of that performer to appear in the creative process, because I think this is something super tricky, and this is something I feel like maybe like normative person might not be well aware of, especially when they work with disabled person. So I feel like this is a really important point to say, to how to create that ground for agency to appear and not to objectify like that person. Because as you mentioned, like when we are in certain like collaborative process, there could be like that kind of like, I'm asking you to be the spectacle of the work, which I think can be like, it can be out of good intent, or like we can never judge that, or it's hard to judge. But at the same time, like how to avoid, or like having that sensitivity of that agency, for me is a very important reminder. And as you mentioned about like first work, maybe I think in the next section, I think you can share also a bit some of the video and some of the work that is important in your artistic journey, and then we can see how it evolves. Because I know that from our previous conversation that also the focus also shifted, kind of because you also brought about like that ableism, like how the society and infrastructure and the external factor actually govern us or like suggest us or even limit us, like our imagination towards body performance and everything. So maybe we can start off with the first work that you mentioned, evolution, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point to share that. Perfect.
Cool. So shall we ask Kim to share the screen for evolution, the trailer? Thank you. Thank you, Kim. So after we have seen the trailer for Evolution, yeah, so I feel like you have gathered like all this inspiration and experiences and then put into the, first solo of yours. And so how was the work received during that time? And was that something that you have expected? And how would that like affect what you were doing afterwards?
Wow. Well, I don't know. I haven't thought about how it was received. I guess it was received well, very well. Hence, I guess that's partly why I've had the career that I've had since. I think it was incredibly well received. I think it really shocked me actually, because yeah, it's amazing that it's 17 years. It's quite shocking to realize now, but I mean, it was interesting the piece itself it's actually the story of me learning to dance. That's the kind of trajectory within the piece, and it in very particular ways. It's in three sections. The first section is very floor based, and was really because I had been introduced to a lot of working on the floor and what I understand maybe is techniques that came from Laban, but learning a lot about connections in the body, how the legs are connected through the body to, and how the limbs sort of work as counterweight. And there was this sort of extraordinary knowledge that I began to realize when I worked with contemporary dancers of these ways of understanding the mechanics of the body that I didn't know, or I had never had a space to reveal it, really. And the time, I think this is one of the most important aspects, is time. Being given time to investigate and explore with people is one of the most important things, I think, in terms of allowing particularly disabled individuals to find find their bodies as dancers, for example. And so this realization that there were like more, once I understood different mechanics of my body, then I could find more efficient ways to move, that the body moves in spirals actually. And I remember being quite frustrated at first, just going, wait a minute, you have all this knowledge that's kind of being kept in this silo of young athletic people, when actually there's a lot of people in the world who really benefit from the things that dancers learn about their bodies. And so there was a lot of realizations that I got of like, oh, and ways that I could strengthen my body and condition my body that I got from dancers, and also from working with Bill specifically. There was just this, that's why the piece is called Evolution. It was really this way that I felt that my body was able to evolve but on my own terms, which felt different from how I'd been exposed to sort of physiotherapy, etc., as a child, which even though it had good intentions, it felt very forced in from the outside. And so there was this sense of, yeah, going through the trajectory also, because I had gone to ballet classes as a very young child, 6 or 7, but I didn't continue because I couldn't physically keep up with the movement, that was the vocabulary. And so also what it was to come back to something like ballet and do what I would now call crippet. So this is a crip being a sort of more political term and identity, but also a verb, you can crip something. So what it was to bring a sort of disability aesthetics to ballet and say, okay, I'm going to come to ballet, but I'm going to do it on my terms. And I'm going to do things with 4 crutches that are not possible for a non-disabled ballet dancer to do. Like, you can't suspend yourself up in the air on your own, but I can with with my crutches. So that thing of like taking it, yeah, on my own terms, but also taking it somewhere new. And then the third section being more about a sort of improvisation and a sort of freedom to move really with my own vocabulary, not trying to be in a ballet mode or anything that was conventional. So there's something about what it was to sort of, I think also to take a piece like that out to the dance audience and dance curators, I think was quite an interesting sort of provocation for many of them, because although there were quite a few companies in the UK and America that were sort of supporting and training and what's the word, platforming disabled dancers, there weren't very many disabled choreographers yet at that point. That was 2007. A few people, but there weren't many people who were making from a disabled experience. And I think that's also partly why the work got the attention, because there weren't many other disabled makers at that time. So it was potentially a bit unusual for people, like one of the first things they might have seen genuinely being generated from a disabled experience, as opposed to being a non-disabled choreographer with a disabled artist, was really mostly what had been seen up till that point. And so I think there's that aspect of it. And then there's a whole thing when we first met that we talked about that was also about what it was to start being a choreographer. And one of the things about that piece is that I was having ideas for like movement and material that I could make, but I was a singer. I didn't know how to use space. And so also it was about inviting colleagues in and collaborators, because although I could make material, I didn't know how to work in 3 dimensions, And so just being given, there was a lot of those tools that I had to learn of like, how do I move it around the stage? That doesn't just happen it can happen in one place. There's nothing wrong with that, but just needing support and collaboration to think, how does it move in space, and what are the 3 sections? How are they distinct from each other? There was a lot to learn from those things that I didn't know. And when I look back on the piece also, I can see it's quite a traditional, I would call it quite a traditional piece of contemporary dance, in the sense that I was making work based on what I thought a dance piece should be, based on what I had been exposed to so far, which wasn't a lot. I hadn't seen a lot of contemporary dance, but I recognize when I look at it now that it's filled with things like ideas of sort of conventional dance ideas around sort of athleticism and speed, and what ideas of sort of showing virtuosity in quite normative ways. So jumping, dramatic balances. Like I recognize that now as me sort of, yeah, making work in the mold of what I was already seeing or what I thought dance should be. Like it moves along. It doesn't stop for very long. It's always in a kind of keep entertaining people. Don't let them get bored. And it's a plain black box. The audience are all sitting out in the dark. I'm expecting them all to be very quiet. I'm expecting them probably all to be sighted and have vision. It's made for a very sort of conventional relationship with an audience, which, as time went on, began to change in my practice. And I would say there was a solo that I made, for example, in 2014, so 7 years later, called Give Me a Reason to Live, which again is a solo in a plain black box, but I think was really where I had begun to sort of be like, I'm not going to make work that I think people want to, based on what I think people want to see, but I'm going to make work more based on what I think my body wants to do and the speed that my body wants to do, and I would say, a much deeper sort of exploration into how my body moved and how the crutches shape how I move. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good time when you mention the next work. Maybe Kim can share the screen of the trailer of Give Me a Reason to Live. Thank you, King. Yeah, as you mentioned about I think it's also kind of clear that like evolution has very explicit reference to the external perception of dance and what beauty is, as you mentioned, like because like it symbolizes or connotate to the Western standard of beauty of body on stage, so that it tackles quite a lot on the external expectation from the audience within the context of dance, for example. And then I think it's quite clear that Give Me a Reason to Leave tackles quite, as you mentioned, about like how you're seeing yourself and how you want yourself to be seen. And then there in the short trailer, there are parts that I feel like it was very strong for me, is like upfront to the audience and then to let them see the body as it is. And I feel like that part really, it's not like challenge, but then also it's confronting in a way that the audience gaze. And I think gaze in terms of disabled artists, especially for performing arts, is such a delicate subject. Um, yeah, so maybe I have two questions. One is because I know that this commission work has a context as well. So maybe you can share a bit on the context of this commission work. And then the other thing is like the choice of, for example, in that part, of allowing like undressing yourself, and also receiving the gaze very directly. Yeah, and or even more general, like how do you tackle about the gaze of the audience?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was that project, that piece came out of a project which was called the Bosch Project. So it was a collaboration between like 5 European dance agencies in different countries. And it was in relation to a European painter from the medieval ages called Hieronymus Bosch. And it was coming up, it was like the 500th anniversary of his death. I think it must have been. They don't know when he was born, so it must have been his death. But yeah, quite a famous painter, and his work often dealt with, it was religious, it was Christian, and it was very much always around notions of judgment. His work was very vividly around sort of depictions of heaven and hell and what's in between limbo and the things that were supposed to send you to heaven or to hell, the human acts or behavior, or qualities of humanity that might judge you as being worthy or unworthy of going somewhere. And so, yeah, it was a great project, actually. It was an amazing opportunity because it was the first time I made a work in response to an outside sort of invitation or outside stimulus as well, rather than up until that, I'd made 3 works by then: Evolution, Mobile, and Ménage à Trois. And they were all things that I had, had the idea myself of what I wanted to make. And so this piece was the first time I was responding to something that I hadn't chosen. So it was a really good challenge for me. And one of the things I got interested in was that in a lot of his paintings and in his studies and sketches, Bosch had painted beggars, people who are begging or homeless, and that quite often those individuals were depicted as disabled. And that being a common sort of reality for many disabled people at that time. They were either musicians or they were beggars. And so there was something that I was interested a bit about the depiction of disabled people in his paintings. And also then about, for me, it was also about like sort of physicality and the way in which bodies in his paintings were depicted as being sort of worthy and good, and what bodies were depicted as being sinful and full of evil, or to be rejected by society or by heaven. And that quite often that took the form of a physical embodiment, in that people who were going to heaven in his paintings were very vertical, very upright, had very open chests, and very tall and open. And people who were seen as sinful and bad were often sort of bent and hunched and disabled, or yeah. And so I was quite sort of, yeah, obviously I saw my own body within that, and was sort of interested in this, and interested in ideas of how we are, as artists especially, like how we are provoking sympathy or empathy or apathy. So the idea of like, what do those things mean? To be in sympathy or empathy, how are those things different? And empathy maybe being something where you really, sympathy being something where you feel sorry for someone, but it doesn't really affect you, and you can objectify that person. And empathy being ideally something where you feel concern, but you also are invested and understand and maybe want to do something in that situation, it being something that activates or changes perhaps. And that was something I was interested in, of like, what does that mean? And how does it relate to how we look at people, the gaze, or the way that we read people visually. And so for me, that piece was in sort of, as you say, like really coming from a different place than evolution, in that I think for me, it's still, that piece is still invested in, it's still it's still really deeply investigating the virtuosity that I have with my crutches and my body, but in a much more subtle way, in a way that's not about sort of entertaining, but doing very specific, unusual, very difficult movement with the crutches. But it's not pretty and it's not elegant. It's actually often what would be conceived, like some of those positions of me upside down might be considered very awkward, very ugly, but they're very athletic, they're very virtuosic, in the same way as jumping and leaping in evolution is. And so for me, it was, yeah, there was a sort of investigation into that virtuosity, and what it is to actually work very hard, also in front of an audience in a different way. And then this question of like, the piece was also related to this idea of like, as a disabled person, what it is to be sort of objectified and what it is to be judged. And the very, very difficult situation that disabled people find themselves in, of having to prove how capable you are, having to prove what you can do, but often also having to prove what you can't do in life, that you have to prove where your limitations are in order to get the support that you need. So, and that being a very ugly and unpleasant and very uncomfortable existence, having to prove your limitations to people. And it's not specific to disability, it exists for many people in many, you know, visa processes, asylum processes, you know, asking for government support for anything, trying to get a job. Like, it happens in different ways for people. But this was a very particular sort of way that I was interested in, that thing of like, what is it to have to spend your life proving that you are deserving of respect, of care, of empathy, of and so that moment in the piece, there's a halfway through, it sort of shifts into this moment where I put my crutches down and I try to stand for as long as I can in front of an audience, and we bring the lights up on the audience so I can see them, and they've been able to see me for the first half of the piece, and now I can see them And I spend the whole time sort of looking. I take a lot of time to look people one by one in the eye, and also they can see each other. So there's a sort of shifting of, for me, what I consider a sense of like mutual witnessing. So it goes from this sort of anonymous performer out in the dark, an anonymous audience, to like an act of like mutually witnessing each other, and also witnessing the fact that it's quite clear that I begin to be in pain during that scene. It begins to genuinely become painful until I have to make the choice to then pick up my crutches again. And so I recognized that moment in that piece was quite an important shift generally in my practice, where from there on, quite often the performance pieces that I made always created a space where it was about mutual witnessing. I began to shift from this place of wanting to create this different hierarchy. Sometimes it's the performer and sometimes it's the audience, but like actually trying to want to create a space where we're all together. And not about, it was never about sort of making an audience feel sort of scrutinized, or to make people, what's the word, to sort of pick people out or make them uncomfortable. I think that piece is very, like what you were talking about, it's a lot about discomfort. Like it's about being together in the discomfort. Actually, they're uncomfortable, I'm uncomfortable, and like what it is to be in that together, and to come out of it together, I think. So there was definitely a shift in my work from that moment in that piece, actually, and that choice. The work I began to make afterwards are often, the audience are often still lit and able to see each other, and I can see them. And it's much more about a sense of trying to create a community for an evening is something that became interesting to me going forward. Yeah.
Well, I think I really appreciate sensitivity in your creative practice of how you recognize the circumstances and the context, and how you're using your work to acknowledge and to also allow audiences to experience that as well. Because I think when you share about the mutual witnessing, I feel like it's also so much about not just about the visual or one way like perception of that performances, but then they are actually you make the situation, you also allow them to witness each other, so that you're kind of also putting them into that active role of like, okay, so you're not like hiding or invisible, but then, and also by doing that, to recognize the hierarchy that is actually existing very commonly in theater setting. I think by recognizing that theater apparatus or convention or certain ways of doing things as a ritual, and how do you as an artist to make performances that actually question about it in the performance making, which for me I feel like is really sensible and also very like provocative in another sense. Yeah, and I really like this idea of you bringing up like sympathy and empathy, because I think this is also super important, because it also for me about the activeness of changes in yourself, and also about the power of dynamic and position that you are in different relationship. And I think this is also something, yeah, I feel like the whole conversation is actually about how to position yourself in different situation, and how to create that scenario and situation that we are all in different setting, and how to make use of theater or performance. Because I also know that you are also expanding your practice outside of theater as well, or like reconsider theater setting in your performance making process. Yeah, so maybe we should like to share a bit on after that shift, and how are you working and creating?
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. Yeah, how to position yourself. That's a really I like that way of considering that. Yeah, I think also what began to change for me, not only with this idea of like wanting to mutually witness, but also it became really more important to me as well that I think also because when my work was performed, I would tend to have disabled audience, hopefully, usually attend, or people who identified as disabled, attend my shows. And I began to really also want to sort of speak to that and notice, I wanted to notice that that was happening and acknowledge, and also to develop that more, to bring more disabled audience into theatres and to sort of recognise how to do that or where that was a problem, why it wasn't happening in many places. And so I began to really, as I was making performance, I began to really also consider during the making of the work itself, like how might disabled people engage with this performance? So not just making a show and then thinking at the end, okay, let's put a sign language interpreter at the side, or let's add some audio description afterward. Those things had been there, but they had been much more sort of like afterwards. And then I started to really want to sort of consider how that was built into the piece more as I made the work. We call it embedded access, or the aesthetics of access is a name that it gets kind of considered as well, or creative access also. And so beginning to think about how that might exist more, but also how that might shape the work itself. By thinking about that during the making of a work, how might it actually be part of making the material? How might the show be different, actually, and better, and all, hopefully, and more interesting, to also think about those things. And so it began to also, as you say, like I was starting to really consider theatre spaces and really look at these, like you say, the ritual of theatre as well, like what are the formalities of these spaces and the etiquette of these spaces, much of which is not spoken, like we don't think about it, it's just presumed. So the idea that these spaces have been designed for expecting people who are all sighted, expecting people who are all hearing, expecting people who can walk upstairs and take a seat, expecting people who can sit on chairs for long periods of time in the dark and be still and be quiet and be able to concentrate on one thing. So there's a lot of presumptions of the bodies and minds that will come to those spaces. And I was like, that's not my friends, actually, and that's not my audience, and that's not my community, are not those bodies. So I began to really want to think, how do we create spaces that also, a lot of those theatre spaces, if they do say, yes, you can come to our theatre, even if you're in a wheelchair, it'll be like, you can come to our theatre, but you have to sit there. You can only sit there. That's it. You can have those two spaces at the front or right at the back. If you want a sign language, you have to sit there. If you want audio description, you have to sit at the back with a headset on, so you don't disturb other people. And I really wanted to turn that upside down and be like, no, actually, if other people are disturbed by this, that is their problem. It's not, the problem is not the people who need this stuff. I want to prioritize those people. And so that paying attention to those things and what is better for people who need those things means that I began to create spaces quite often where the audience for example, might be more on stage. Not all of the audience, but some of the audience have a choice to be on stage. So that means that there are more seating choices because there are more people sitting on the level. So if you are in a wheelchair, you can sit on lots of different angles. You don't have to sit in that corner over there. If you need to lie down, there is a possibility that you could lie down and that's more comfortable for you. Possibilities that people might need to leave a performance. They might need to leave and come back, or they might need to leave and not come back, and to go, how do I, like, that can be a thing for disabled people, but it can be a thing for lots of people for lots and lots of reasons. And it's like, how can I make that a thing that's like, if this is not enjoyable to you, or if it's really a difficult space for you, then yeah, you should leave and you shouldn't feel bad about it. Like, and so wanting to create spaces that gave people that permission, because also my observation from sitting in traditional theatres is if I feel like I can't leave, I become more preoccupied and worried about that, of feeling like I'm stuck, that stops me actually engaging with the performance. Whereas if I'm in a gallery or an installation work and I know I can wander in and I can leave, I'm much more likely to take my time and engage with the work that's happening, because I know I don't feel pressured, I don't feel stuck. And so noticing that actually that consent and agency affects how people engage and concentrate with a work, with a performance. So trying to make spaces that allow that, for example, or if you're going to make really loud noise, or if you're going to have physical touch and interaction with an audience, like, how can you make sure that, like, that's really frightening for some people. It's really frightening. It's really problematic for some people. And not to say you can't do it in a show, but to go, we can do it, but let's do it in a way that's consensual. So ways that say, if you're okay with this, then you can sit in these seats. But if you're not okay with it, that's totally fine, and sit over there. And I promise no one will touch you. And you can have just that. There's no one experience is not better than the other, but like people really have that choice. And so it began to be a thing of like, how could you create spaces that allow for that? And then allow that to shape the work itself. And I think more and more, and also this thing of sometimes then, as you say, theatres maybe not being the best place for people. You know, if people have never, disabled people, or certainly in other place, like people of colour, or people who are not first language speakers of that country, like whatever, like they've never been welcome in that space before, why would they come there? So what do you need to do to, maybe the work needs to not be in the theatre, but it needs to be somewhere else. So I also started making work that was in community halls or on a beach, or, you know, and also questioning that the theatre was the right place for the work. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it's really insightful to hear like the artistic trajectory of how you consider those pre-assumption or even like limitation or convention, and then turn it into something that is workable. And I feel like this is, for me, honestly, I feel like this is like the real power of art and artists that are really like sensitive and at the same time try to open up like possibility, because what I heard is so much about options, consensus, pre-assumption, and being open to it, and but not taking it for granted, but at the same time to see how we can use our imagination and creativity to actually to navigate and to play with it. And this has become the resources and capital that we can, the materials that we can play with. And I feel like what is still embedded into your journey is also that playfulness. So it's not like everything has to be serious, but at the same time, so okay, this is on my table. Like, how can we make it work? And I think this is super interesting also to start to look into what the site is actually providing us and what is that reality and what is theater, what is non-theatrical space, and how can we do with that, and what kind of body are we inviting? Because I think you also mentioned about like, because of all this limitation, like certain bodies are restricted or having certain limited choices. And I think when we start to recognize it, and how do we actually, as you said, build a community that are welcome to the theater or like attending the performance, even if it's not a theater, for me is a really interesting take. And think about the nature of a performance, because like as you said, like you can leave and then you don't have to feel pressure if you do that. And yeah, I feel like it's something that also for me needs a lot of negotiation with like, you know, the venue, the commission partners and everything. And I think maybe this is a good time to also step into how does that, like your artistic journey is kind of like evolving, and how is the external environment or funding or venues presenters are adapting to this model of working together, because I feel like this is also a collaborative process with those organizations and bodies. Would you like to share that?
Yeah. Yeah, I really love that you touched on imagination there, by the way, because I think that's at the core of it. And sometimes I find it sort of so frustrating at times that, you know, yeah, theatre directors, I can't possibly put a sign language interpreter on my stage, or I can't possibly do this, or we can't bring people through that door. And it's like, we work in the arts. Use your imagination. This is what we're supposed to be about, is imagination. Just yeah, I often find that astonishing, of just like we become the thing that we are set up to sort of push against always. And in that way, yeah, I sometimes, it's so frustrating of like how formalized things get even in the arts at times. But yeah, I mean, this is a big part of the work, is also that quite often maybe my shows are maybe the first performance that a venue or a theatre or a festival have had, which comes with a lot of this embedded access and this ethos around it of engaging with disabled audience. And so yeah, I mean, that is a real aspect of it, is that there is a lot of this additional sort of negotiation and sort of teaching that mainly now really falls to my producers rather than me. I'm sort of in a very privileged position where I'm sort of buffered from having to do that myself now, because that's what my producers do. So they are the people who have all the first difficult conversations. But there is I think what is also been an important aspect is this idea of it being part of the work, that this is not something that's additional. It's like, this is the work, actually, that the audience have to all come in the same entrance is part of the piece, you know. So like, that is one of the things that we try to make sure happens. This get away from this idea that there's a main entrance and then people in wheelchairs or with walkers have to come in round the back of the building. It's like, no. Actually, if that's the entrance, everybody has to come that way. And so it being very clear that if you invite this show that I've made, then this is part of the experience. And generally, I guess, I think also it's different for me because of where my reputation is and the kind of experience, the sort of longevity of time that I would say nowadays promoters and venues understand what they're bringing, even if they know it's going to be new and a challenge in their venue. They recognize, having come to the show, like, okay, this is all part of it as well. So yeah, but I think it's also an important aspect of inviting sort of venues and curators to also be part of a different engagement with their organization, of realizing like this really needs tied into your marketing. People have to come on board. Your marketing people have to be part of this choice and journey, because they're going to have to reach outside of their conventions. They're going to have to start thinking, oh, wait, there's a whole bunch of people we haven't reached. And how do we reach those people? Maybe we have to go back to radio. Maybe we have to make videos, you know, and the technical staff, you know, being sort of then sort of also brought on board to go, yeah, actually the audience are going to come in a different way. So you're going to have to clean the back shop. The audience might come from backstage. How can we make this work? And how to also get the staff excited by that, rather than being like, oh, you know, this is extra work for us, but going, you know, how is this? And I think, yeah, that's usually the sort of also that thing of hoping that when we bring work like this, it's the start of something rather than like a one-off. Like they're like, okay, yeah, we can have audio description. How could we do this with more work? Or that you have local artists then who see the work and they're like, I want to try and bring some of this into my work. How could we make this possible? And hopefully start conversations locally, if I've come in somewhere that, you know, is far from home. So I think it's also just about, yeah, like I guess also the bravery of curators, like finding curators that are willing to sort of, yeah, trust the work, and sort of, yeah, it shouldn't be a risk, but it potentially, of course, is, to choose something that's not familiar or hasn't been done in their space before. So often, I think that is always one of the problems with this aspect of like coming from any marginalized experience, is that you're often at the mercy of like one individual that really believes in it and is really working very hard. And it's that thing of trying to shift that a whole team or a whole organization gets on board. And I think that's when really extraordinary things happen, when you see a whole festival begin to be like, oh no, this is an ethos. We're going to start really putting access information into all of our brochure. You know, and that sometimes that I think the thing is also just making, I think, venues and festivals, etc., understand that by sort of bringing in some of the strategies that disabled artists introduce, it actually benefits everybody. Like if you make the print bigger in your brochure, it will help everyone, not just people with a visual impairment, because it will make it easier to read for everyone. If you make a little video that tells people how to find your venue, it's not just helpful for a visually impaired person or a deaf audience member who've not been to your venue before. It also means a tourist is going to find your venue easier, you know. So I don't really like that. I don't like that strategy of going, you should care because it's better for people who are not disabled. Like that's a really problematic trajectory. Or strategy, but the reality is that quite often by bringing a lot of these approaches in, it it's really about making more people welcome. It's not always just specifically for disabled individuals. So I think that's the thing, that if you could just get more people to recognize that sometimes.
Yeah, I totally see what you mean. I feel like this sensitivity is also about how to recognize values, like how to, it's not like specifically for like some person, but then it's actually what it is. Like if we implement that, like what does that do? And I also like I think it's also very inspiring to hear, like, because I think what you're doing is not just like a product, but more like, okay, so the work is the experience itself. Like from the beginning of it, from the like marketing and all the way to the way that they enter to the performance space, is the experience, is the work itself. It's not just some spectacle that will happen in the black box, like in the dark space. And I think this is a very important also reminder, as you said, that, and as we move forward, like how does also theater performance progress with like the society and how we see the things and the work, and how to embed that mentality into production? Because sometimes I feel like there is a discrepancy between like production and creation, and how much like the presenter, the theater, the curator recognizing that overlapping of like the entrance is part of it, and how much they can go further with it. I feel like is an important way, especially so much art is being in a way consumed and being seen as entertainment. But I think the way that we are trying to propose some new strategies and new ways of seeing the world and the conventional practice is also something some of the artists are trying really hard to get. So it's not about able or disabled, it's to recognizing what are we actually creating and presenting. And I think this is very important, especially to share from your experience of doing and making it in different contexts and seeing the trajectory of your artistic practice. So I think I have one more question for you, just to kind of like try to sum it up, because as we mentioned, like you're also an educator now. So I'm also very curious personally, like if you give some advice for your student about like creating art or like disabled art, what would the important like pillars in things that you will kind of like share with them?
Wow. Yeah, I was thinking a bit about this, and sometimes, like when I think about it, so my teaching historically up until now has more been through sort of like workshop formats quite often, or I guess sometimes sort of presentation style, maybe like this as well. And I think also what I realize more that I get reflected back to me afterwards is I tend to share the things that I love, the things that I love and that have made me very fascinated in movement, for example. I think that's always a good place to share from, is like, what are the things that excite you, you know? And bring other people in on that curiosity. I think what's more important, I think, for me, I realize, is how you create the space for sharing or exchange. I think sometimes I think that maybe now is more important than what you exchange. I'm realizing like how I create a space for exchange in a similar way to the performance pieces. How do I create an environment where people can be how they need to be, how their bodies and minds need to be, and sort of recognizing that, of like, how to create spaces where we let go of ideas of speed, like everybody should be working at this speed or moving at this speed or thinking at this speed or communicating at this speed. How can you create a space where people can work at very different scales of physical a physical scale, like can work in really tiny movement or really big movement, that the dynamics can be very different, or the speed with which people move and the time it takes, that these can all be different, and the amount of energy that people want and need to work with can all be different, but that nobody, how do you let go of the ideas of comparison in that space and say that, and let go of the idea that it should look like this, or it should be at this speed, or it should happen within this time. And I think that's been the thing that I think is the most important aspect of trying to think how, not so much what I give in an educational environment, but how I host that space. And that often being something that people take away is that, okay, yeah, we didn't go through that exercise like this, or I'm used to going to a workshop and they do 5 tasks and we only did 2, but we really took our time on those 2 things. And that being maybe about, yeah, having the confidence to just stay with that thing and make sure everybody's in it in the way that works for them. I think that's been a really important thing to recognize for myself, of like, yeah, I've learned a lot about how to do that by making these performances as well that are trying to say, I want you to be here and experience this way, in the right way for your body. And also that I thought about you being here, that I want you here and it matters that you're here, I think is sort of at the root of I think, yeah, making any sort of experience, whether it's a performance or a workshop, but like recognizing, it really matters to me that people are there, and I acknowledge what it took for you to be here. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or if it's too big and esoteric.
No, I mean it's very also like for me there is still a thread like throughout, I don't know, like your interest or practice is also about how to say that, it's almost like how you imagine like the receiver or the spectator. Like maybe like at the very beginning, it's like we imagine it's like homogeneous, kind of like okay with certain quality. But then later on, like, I imagine like you can also see each other. And then maybe later on it's like, okay, so maybe each of us has very different like quality in our body or mind. And then how do we actually imagine like multiples to me, like, or like a community is actually consists of like multiple individuals, and how their needs, their experience can be respected in a way that you can create that space for them. I feel like that is a super important, especially I think it's also so much about performing arts as well, because it's about like the witnessing, the spectatorship, and so there has to be like someone being there for the performance to happen. And I think that imagination of either like they're disabled or not doesn't really matter. It's like that individual. So I think that for me goes back to like when we make a performance, what are they for? And I think it's a very interesting and important reminder of like all this presumption that we have towards like the participant or audiences, and how do we also expand our spectrum of seeing things. And yeah, I really appreciate like the things that you share with us today. And is there anything that you, as the last bits that you want to share?
I don't think so. No, I think I've said quite a lot actually. So I've talked maybe too much. No, I think we touched on a lot of things, and yeah, I really appreciate the sort of the sort of questions and the sort of provocations, and I really appreciate the sort of perspectives that you offered as well. It's very encouraging, and I mean, yeah, I think it'd be good. Like we can share maybe the video of the way you look at me tonight, which was an interesting sort of return to Jess Curtis, who started my career, and I then went away and learned to make, and we came back together, and that was really the beginning of us trying to think about this way of making a world and a performative experience that really tried to speak to a lot of these things about mutual witnessing and embedded access as a sort of really a creative force in the work, and what that meant also to develop. I think there's importance in imagining how other people might experience your work, but also the necessity of actually being with those people.
We take turns being between the other and the ground.
And my face turns with him.
The floor, the earth.
And his head is now resting on mine.
Is she ticklish?
Gravity holds us together.
I take the weight of his head.
All of us.
Cheek to cheek.
We can move apart, but only a certain amount.
Is his weight on her cheek?
And let its weight pass through me out into the floor.
And only in this one dimension.
What are they paying attention to?
We remain in contact.
We turn our bodies gradually, curling away from.
Our attention is in our touch.
Then into each other like a.
I feel her body.
Peaceful, silent swastika.
I feel when it welcomes mine and when it says no.
Is it possible for them to blot me out?
Of breath and bare feet.
Not now.
Turning slowly around.
Not there.
Is it possible to blot an audience out?
Try over here.
When I reach my hand for him,
back.
I find him.
Let's go back to you.
Why would you want
and then past
to
him.
do that?
My turn to go.
Reaching
Isn't it
with
all
hands.
about
My
the
turn
audience?
to take
Out
away.
into the air.
What questions are they asking?
If you want to make something genuinely accessible, you have to work with people who have that experience. You have to bring disabled people into the process, and really, really find out what they're experiencing. We have imagination up to a point of others, but then we really just need to make connections with people, and we need to work with people who have those experiences, and that's a big part of it. I mean, I don't imagine how a deaf audience experiences my work. I bring a deaf person and I bring sign language interpreters in while I'm making the work. And then you have to change things potentially. And you have to be willing to change. I think that's at the root of everything, I guess, isn't it? You have to be open to change and to see that as improvement as well, rather than holding on to this conventional idea of the artistic soul, vision, genius as well. I think it's also about letting go of that to go, what happens if I let other people shape my vision, and how it becomes better for that, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that idea of also letting go is very important, because that also opens up, like, yeah, if this is not what things that I'm so fascinated about, like, but adding some other opinions, perspective, and what would that be? Like having the eye to see what it is, I think is also super important. So I think Kim can later on add on the video of the way that you look at me tonight as some in past that we talked about it. And so thank you very much, Claire. I really had a great conversation, and I feel like it's super, yeah, inspiring to hear from your experience and your point of view. And I do hope to see your work live somewhere soon.
Thank you. I believe we might be coming to Hong Kong next spring. I'm still I'm still waiting to hear if it's confirmed, but I'm
Right.
hoping we might bring a new show. My new solo hopefully might be
Oh
coming
my
there.
God.
So we will let you know as soon as possible.
Yes, please
And
do. Please
let your
do.
audience know. But yeah, I hope
Yes.
to meet in person too. It's been really wonderful. Thank you so much for the conversation, Joseph. It's been great.
Thank you, Claire. If that can work out, like let's hang
Fingers
out.
crossed.
Yes, finger crossed with you. Thank you very much, Claire. And do you want to say goodbye to the audience here?
Yeah, thank you so much for everybody for joining. I appreciate it. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.